Cheryl Bernett was a young mother with dreams as bright as the California sun. Her life revolved around her son, whom she loved fiercely, determined to provide him with the best future she could. Friends and family described Cheryl as warm, intelligent, and independent, with a deep love for art and literature. She worked hard to make ends meet, balancing her responsibilities as a mother with the ambition to build a secure future for her small family. Her apartment was modest but comfortable, a place she had begun to make a home for herself and her child. Life was moving forward, full of hope and the simple joys of raising her son. But that hope was shattered on a quiet night in 1965. The morning air was crisp when a concerned neighbor noticed something unusual. Cheryl had not been seen all morning. Her apartment lights, still glowing from the previous night, signaled that something was wrong. A knock on the door went unanswered, and soon worry turned to action. When the door was finally opened, the gruesome scene inside would haunt the community for years to come. Cheryl Bernett lay motionless on her bed. A black silk slip covered her face, a chilling reminder of the brutality she had suffered. She was nude, her body exposed and violated, with a drapery cord wound tightly around her neck, leaving no doubt about the manner of her death. The neighbor, overcome with horror, backed away, barely able to form words before calling the authorities. Within minutes, the apartment was swarming with police, but no one could erase the grim reality that had unfolded within those walls. The murder of Cheryl Bernett sent shockwaves through El Cajon. The quiet suburban town, home to about 40,000 residents at the time, had been relatively peaceful. Women now locked their doors with trembling hands. Men watched their wives and daughters with protective eyes. Everyone whispered the same question: who could have done this? And was he still lurking in the shadows? Jerry Earp, a dedicated and seasoned detective, was among the first to arrive at the scene. He carefully examined the crime scene, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. Every detail mattered, but forensic science in 1965 was rudimentary at best. There were no DNA tests and no advanced crime scene techniques. Detectives relied on fingerprinting, fibers, and witness accounts, tools that often left more questions than answers. They dusted the apartment for prints, collected what little evidence they could, and took note of the bedsheet, hoping it might hold a clue. Days passed. Weeks stretched into months. The case, once the town's greatest horror, began to fade into the background of everyday life. Leads ran cold, suspects were questioned and released, and eventually, Cheryl Bernett became another unsolved murder in the growing pile of cold cases. Then another tragedy struck, one that would further plunge El Cajon into fear. Louis and Lola Mercer had been married for 28 years, their bond unshakable. They had just moved into their new apartment on Chambers Street, excited about a fresh start. Their days were filled with unpacking, settling in, and making their new place feel like home. But just 5 nights after moving in, their lives would be changed forever. In the dead of night, a man crept through an open window, his presence an unseen nightmare. He struck Louis first, his blows brutal and merciless. Blood splattered against the walls as he bludgeoned him, the violence so severe that Louis never stood a chance. The man then turned to Lola, delivering the same relentless force. She was raped, beaten, and left for dead, her body barely clinging to life. When police arrived at the scene, they were met with sheer devastation. Louis was gone, his life stolen in a moment of unspeakable cruelty. Lola, barely breathing, was rushed to the hospital. But while her body would recover, her mind never would. The trauma had caused irreversible brain damage, erasing any memory she had of the attack. The police had no witnesses, no description, and no concrete leads. The predator had vanished into the night, leaving only carnage in his wake. The Mercer attack sent the town into a deeper state of paranoia. 2 brutal cases, seemingly unconnected, but eerily similar in their violence. Was there a serial killer stalking the streets of El Cajon? The fear was palpable. Women refused to leave their homes alone. Men walked their loved ones to and from work. Doors that were once left unlocked now remained bolted shut. Detectives pored over evidence, desperate for a breakthrough. But with no viable forensic technology at their disposal, the investigation stalled. Then, in July 1965, another attack occurred, this time in La Mesa. A nurse was assaulted in her own home, left beaten and barely alive. This time, however, the attacker made a mistake. A neighbor, who had noticed a prowler in the area a few nights earlier, had jotted down a license plate number. That number led investigators to a name: Clyde Carl Wilkerson, a former felon with a criminal history that included assault and robbery. When police placed Wilkerson in a lineup, the La Mesa nurse identified him immediately. He was arrested on charges of attempted murder, but the question lingered. Was he also responsible for Cheryl Bernett and the Mercer murders? Detective Jerry Earp, still haunted by the unsolved cases, visited Wilkerson in jail, pressing him about the crimes. But Wilkerson remained stone-faced, refusing to speak. In November 1965, he was sentenced to 5 years to life for the La Mesa attack. For the first time in months, El Cajon felt a sense of relief. The murders had stopped. The town slowly returned to normal. But Cheryl Bernett and Louis Mercer had been forgotten by the legal system. Their killer had never been caught. Years passed, then decades. The world evolved, and science advanced. In a police evidence warehouse, a single bedsheet sat untouched, holding a secret that had waited for over 3 decades. In 1999, forensic scientist Connie Milton reopened the Bernett case, determined to use modern DNA testing to find answers. She pulled the bedsheet from storage, carefully analyzing the fabric under a microscope. What she found stunned her: sperm cells, still intact after 34 years. She ran the DNA through a national database. The results were undeniable: a perfect match. The sample belonged to none other than Clyde Carl Wilkerson. Detectives scrambled to locate Wilkerson, who had since been released and was living a quiet life in Benton, Arkansas. But his past had finally caught up with him. 3 days later, he was arrested and extradited to California to face justice. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. DNA had sealed his fate. The courtroom was filled with the families of Cheryl Bernett and Louis Mercer, their eyes locked onto the man who had stolen so much from them. Wilkerson, now an aging man, showed little emotion. For decades he had believed he had gotten away with murder, but now there was nowhere left to run. The judge's sentence was clear: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Cheryl Bernett's son, who had grown up never knowing his mother, there was finally some closure. For the families of Louis and Lola Mercer, there was justice, though it could never undo the pain. Wilkerson was sent to a California correctional facility to live out the rest of his days behind bars. But one question remained: how many others had fallen victim to him? His years as a truck driver had given him access to countless towns, countless roads, and countless unsuspecting women. Detectives continued searching for more victims. But for the families of Cheryl Bernett and Louis Mercer, the wait for justice had finally ended. It had taken 37 years. A single bedsheet, a few seconds of DNA testing, and the saliva on an old envelope to finally bring a murderer to justice. A case like Cheryl Bernett's serves as a chilling reminder that justice, though delayed, is never truly out of reach. Advances in forensic science have given law enforcement powerful tools to solve crimes that once seemed unsolvable. But there are still countless cold cases waiting for answers and families waiting for closure. If you have any information about an unsolved case, no matter how small, don't hesitate to come forward. Your voice could be the missing piece that brings justice to a victim long forgotten. Support organizations that fight for justice. Advocate for better forensic resources and never stop demanding that the past is not left buried. As this case proves, justice may take decades, but it never forgets. On a warm summer evening in 1976, in the quiet neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia, Sam Guy sat on his front porch watching his son David play catch with the neighborhood kids. A devoted father, a respected detective, and a man who had spent his life protecting the streets of Atlanta, Sam was more than just a cop. He was a hero to those who knew him. His life had been dedicated to service. From an early age, Sam had been drawn to law enforcement, inspired by his father, who had worked as a sheriff's deputy. A standout athlete in high school, he had once considered a baseball career but ultimately chose to follow in his father's footsteps. He attended the police academy straight out of school, eager to make a difference. As an officer, Sam Guy was well-liked among his colleagues and deeply respected by his community. He was the kind of man who treated every citizen with dignity, whether they were a victim or a suspect. He believed in justice, not just for those who could afford it, but for everyone. That belief would cost him his life. On the night of February 12, 1976, Detective Sam Guy was working a routine shift when a call came in. A robbery was in progress at the Howard Johnson Hotel just outside downtown Atlanta. Without hesitation, Sam responded. He had faced armed criminals before, but this time, fate had other plans. Inside the lobby, two masked men brandished weapons demanding cash from the front desk clerk. As Sam entered, he identified himself, his badge flashing in the dim light. But the robbers didn't hesitate. They opened fire. Gunshots echoed through the hotel. A bullet struck Sam in the leg, tearing through his femoral artery. He fired back, wounding one of the men before collapsing to the floor. In the chaos, the robbers fled, disappearing into the rainy night. By the time backup arrived, Detective Sam Guy was bleeding out. Officers tried to save him, but it was too late. Sam Guy died on the floor of the hotel lobby, his service weapon still clutched in his hand. He was survived by his son, David, who was just beginning his career in law enforcement. The loss shattered him. Sam had been more than a father. He had been a mentor, a guide, and a symbol of everything David aspired to be. The funeral was attended by hundreds. Officers from across the state came to pay their respects. Friends, family, and even citizens who had never met Sam but had benefited from his kindness gathered to mourn. The streets were lined with people as his casket was carried to its final resting place. But as the years passed, the case of Sam Guy's murder grew cold. The bullets recovered from the scene yielded no leads. Witnesses provided conflicting descriptions of the suspects. And despite efforts by detectives, no arrests were made. David Guy, still reeling from the loss, poured himself into his work. He rose through the ranks, becoming a deputy sheriff. But one thing never left his mind. The men who had killed his father were still out there. He vowed that one day he would bring them to justice. For more than 2 decades, the case remained unsolved. Then, in September 1998, a phone call changed everything. A woman called Atlanta Detective Scott Bennett. Her voice was steady, but there was urgency in her words. She had information about Sam Guy's murder. She gave them a name, Abner Wilkinson, and she mentioned another man, someone she only knew as TJ. Detectives traced the call to Myrtle Wilkinson, Abner's estranged wife. When they met with her, she told them a chilling story. The morning after the murder, Abner had come home and confessed. He had warned her never to speak of it again. For more than 20 years, she had kept quiet, afraid of what he might do. With this new lead, investigators reopened the case. But they needed more than just a statement. They needed proof. They combed through old records, revisiting statements and re-examining evidence. Then they found something. In 1982, David Guy and FBI Special Agent Arthur Krinsky had spoken to an informant named Larry Smith. Smith had also named 2 men as the killers, Abner Wilkinson and Terry Jackson. The names matched. Detectives now had a path forward. They decided to put pressure on Wilkinson, believing he was the weaker link. They spread word in his neighborhood that police were looking for him. They made sure his friends and family knew he was under suspicion. The psychological warfare worked. On September 17, 1999, Abner Wilkinson walked into Atlanta PD headquarters carrying a suitcase. He was ready to confess. In an interview room, Wilkinson laid out the entire story. He and Terry Jackson had planned the robbery, thinking the hotel would be an easy target. When Detective Sam Guy confronted them, things spiraled out of control. Wilkinson admitted to firing his gun, but he claimed it was Jackson who had fired the fatal shot. With Wilkinson's confession, police moved quickly. That same night, they tracked down Terry Jackson at a convenience store. He was arrested without incident. The trial came 2 months later. The prosecution presented Wilkinson's confession, witness testimony, and forensic evidence. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before delivering a verdict. Guilty. Terry Jackson was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Abner Wilkinson, who had cooperated with authorities, was given 12 years. He would serve his sentence at the Hardwick Correctional Facility. In the aftermath of the trial, emotions ran high. Wilkinson, now an aging man, expressed remorse. He apologized to the Guy family, saying he wished they could forgive him. But for David Guy, forgiveness was a complicated thing. His father had been taken from him, and no amount of regret could change that. Still, there was a sense of closure. For 23 years, David had lived with the weight of his father's unsolved murder. Now, at last, justice had been served. At the Atlanta Police Department, Detective Jim Rose continued to honor Sam Guy's legacy. He wore his badge number, a tribute to a man who had given everything for his city. And though Sam Guy was gone, his memory lived on, in the officers who served, in the community he had protected, and in the son who had never stopped searching for the truth. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. The story of Detective Sam Guy is one of sacrifice, perseverance, and justice. But for every case that finds closure, countless others remain unsolved, waiting for the one tip, the one witness, the one moment that brings the truth to light. If you have information about a cold case, no matter how small, now is the time to speak up. Families deserve answers. Justice deserves to be served, and the victims, those who can no longer tell their own stories, deserve to be remembered. Contact your local authorities, submit an anonymous tip, and be the voice that helps bring closure. Because no matter how much time has passed, justice is never out of reach. Jacksonville Beach, Florida, was a place where the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt water through the streets and the golden sands stretched for miles. It was a lively town, full of young professionals and students who were drawn to its vibrant energy. Among them was 25-year-old Corey Parker, an ambitious young woman with an infectious smile and a passion for life. She had recently finished college and was working as a waitress while she planned her next steps. Her friends described her as warm, kind-hearted, and full of life. Corey had dreams, big ones. She wanted to travel, experience the world, and make something meaningful out of her life. But tragically, she never got the chance. The day after Thanksgiving, in 1998, Corey's co-workers grew concerned when she failed to show up for her shift at the restaurant where she worked. She was responsible, punctual, and never the type to miss work without notice. One of her colleagues, uneasy with the situation, decided to check on her. He went to her apartment, knocked on the door, and waited in silence. A chill of dread crept over him. He walked around the apartment searching for a way to peek inside, and when he reached her bedroom window he managed to lift it slightly. What he saw next would haunt him forever. A foot. A human foot, covered in blood. When police arrived at the scene, they were met with a horror unlike any they had ever encountered. Corey's body lay in her bed, curled up in the corner, completely drenched in blood. She had been stabbed 101 times. The sheer brutality of the attack stunned even the most seasoned investigators. The autopsy later revealed something even more disturbing. Many of the stab wounds had been inflicted after she was already dead. This wasn't just a murder. It was an act of rage, an overkill that suggested the killer had a personal obsession with their victim. The crime scene told a story of violence and terror. The killer had entered through a small kitchen window, which was left open just enough for someone to slip inside. Blood was smeared on the windowsill, indicating that the murderers had cut themselves while climbing in or out. In the kitchen, a tiny spot of blood was found on a cabinet, no larger than a fingertip. But the most crucial piece of evidence was something almost unnoticeable: a single strand of hair found near Corey's body. It was a silent witness to the crime, holding within it the identity of a killer. With no immediate suspect, detectives launched a full-scale investigation. They interviewed friends, co-workers, and neighbors, hoping to find anyone with a motive to harm Corey Parker. Flyers with Corey's photo were distributed throughout the city, and news stations broadcasted appeals for information. The police were desperate for a break in the case, but weeks passed with no leads. Then, a woman named Julie Sedgwick walked into the state attorney's office with a tip. She wasn't sure if it was relevant, but something about a former co-worker of hers had been gnawing at her. His name was Robert Eric Denny. Denny had once worked at the same restaurant as Julie, and after Corey's murder, he had suddenly disappeared. He had left town without a word, but that wasn't the only red flag. He had also lived in an apartment directly behind Corey's. His bedroom window had a direct view of hers. As detectives began to dig deeper, they discovered that Denny had a deeply unsettling past. His sister had kicked him out of her home after waking up one night to find him standing over her bed, silently watching her sleep. It sent a shiver down her spine, and she told him to leave. But the most chilling revelation came when investigators learned about Denny's older brother. At just 15 years old, Denny's brother had brutally murdered a woman in Texas, stabbing her nearly 100 times in a frenzied attack. He had been sentenced to life in prison. Growing up, Robert Denny had idolized his brother, calling him his hero. Now, detectives began to wonder, had Denny followed in his brother's footsteps? Investigators were confident they had their suspect, but they needed one final piece of proof: DNA. If they could obtain a sample from Denny, they could compare it to the blood found in Corey's apartment. But there was a problem. How could they get his DNA without tipping him off? They devised an elaborate ruse. Posing as officers investigating an unrelated crime, they brought Denny in for questioning. During the interview, they casually asked him to provide a saliva sample, but Denny, now visibly nervous, refused. His reaction only fueled their suspicions. The next day, detectives followed him around town, watching his every move. Then, they got their lucky break unaware that he was being watched. Denny absent-mindedly spit on the ground. It was the mistake that would seal his fate. Detectives rushed to the spot and carefully swabbed the saliva off the pavement. The sample was sent to the crime lab, and when the results came back, the truth was undeniable. The blood found in Corey's kitchen was a perfect DNA match to Robert Denny. The strand of hair found near her body also matched his DNA. He was the killer. With solid evidence in hand, police prepared to arrest him. But first, they wanted to eliminate any possible defense he might have. They needed him to confirm, in his own words, that he had never met Corey Parker and had never been inside her apartment. If he admitted that, there would be no explanation for why his DNA was found there. To accomplish this, they sent in Detective Katie Kingston. Playing the role of a friendly but clueless investigator, she knocked on Denny's door, acting as if she was just following up on minor details. Oblivious to the trap, Denny spoke freely. When asked if he had ever been inside Corey Parker's apartment, he confidently stated, "No, never." That was all the police needed. 3 hours later, officers arrived at his home with an arrest warrant. Robert Denny was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. His trial was swift. The prosecution presented the overwhelming DNA evidence, the blood in Corey's apartment, and the hair found near her body. On the witness stand, Denny had no explanation. "I don't know," he kept saying. He could not account for how his DNA ended up at the crime scene. The jury saw through his lies. After deliberating for less than a day, they returned with a verdict. Guilty. Robert Denny was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Corey Parker's family, it was justice, but it was also a painful reminder of everything they had lost. They would never get their daughter back. They would never see her live out her dreams. But they could take some solace in knowing that the man who took her life would never be free again. Today, Robert Denny remains behind bars, serving out his sentence in a Florida correctional facility. And Corey Parker's case serves as a haunting reminder. Even the smallest piece of evidence, a drop of blood, a strand of hair, or a careless spit on the ground, can be enough to bring a killer to justice. As Robert Denny sits in a Florida correctional facility, serving a life sentence for the brutal murder of Corey Parker, her family and friends continue to carry the weight of her absence. Her dreams, her potential, were tragically cut short. Yet, in the face of such loss, they find comfort in the justice that was served, knowing that the man responsible will never harm another person again. Corey's story is a painful reminder of the fragility of life, but also the strength of the human spirit. A single strand of hair, a drop of blood, and a small mistake made in a moment of carelessness were the keys to unlocking the truth. It serves as a powerful testament to the importance of paying attention to the smallest details, whether in our personal lives or our pursuit of justice. In the end, Corey's life may have been taken too soon, but her story lives on, reminding us that even in our darkest moments, truth will find a way to surface. Justice will find a way to prevail. If you've been affected by Corey's story, or if you feel compelled to make a difference, we encourage you to learn more about cases like hers. Advocate for victims, support those who are seeking justice, and never underestimate the power of your voice. Share Corey's story. Talk about it. Her memory deserves to be heard. If you or someone you know is struggling with trauma or violence or needs support in any form, there are resources available. Don't be afraid to reach out. Justice isn't just about the end of a case, it's about the healing that begins when the truth is uncovered.